Found out my mom secretly ordered a wedding cake behind my back after I said no multiple times, then started crying when I confronted her. Our wedding is happening this October, and the entire cake situation has turned into an absolute nightmare with my mother. I never thought I'd be posting here about wedding drama, but here we are. When my fiancé proposed last year, we immediately started planning. We're both pretty laid-back people, not the type to obsess over tiny details or demand perfection. The one thing we both felt strongly about was the dessert. Both of us aren't into traditional wedding cakes, those overly sweet, fondant-covered monstrosities that cost a fortune and most guests barely touch. We've been to enough weddings where beautiful cakes sit mostly uneaten at the end of the night, and we didn't want to waste money on something neither of us particularly enjoys. Instead, we wanted something different that actually reflected our tastes. After discussing several options, pies, donuts, etc., we settled on a dessert bar featuring cheesecakes, which we both genuinely enjoy and thought would be a crowd pleaser. We found a local bakery with amazing reviews and set up a tasting. The cheesecakes were incredible, creamy, flavorful, not too sweet. We were sold immediately and got excited about having various flavors for guests to choose from. When I told my mom about our dessert plans, she initially seemed fine with it, but I could tell by her tone that she wasn't thrilled. A week later, she called me up specifically to talk about the cake situation. "You know, weddings have certain traditions that are important," she began. "Guests expect certain things. The cake cutting is one of those special moments everyone looks forward to seeing." I explained that we could still do a cake cutting with a cheesecake, but she wasn't having it. "It's not the same," she insisted. "You need at least a small traditional cake for the cutting ceremony. Just for pictures. Trust me, you'll regret not having those photos later." After discussing it with my fiancé, we reluctantly agreed to compromise. Fine, we'd have a small ceremonial cake alongside our cheesecake station. Nothing elaborate, just something simple we could cut for photos to make my mom happy. We researched bakeries, got quotes, and were about to put down a deposit when my mother dropped her next bomb. We were sitting at my parents' dining table going over the bakery options when she said, "You know, having a cake just for yourselves and not serving it to the guests is actually really tacky," she declared, completely contradicting her earlier position. "People will think you're being selfish. You'll need to order sheet cakes of the same flavor to serve everyone." At this point, my fiancé and I exchanged a look across the table that said everything. This was getting ridiculous. First, we absolutely needed a cake. Now, the compromise we'd agreed to wasn't good enough either. It was becoming clear that what my mother really wanted was a traditional wedding cake, period. "Mom, this is getting out of hand," I said. "First you insist we need a cake for photos, now you're saying that solution is tacky. We're not doing this dance. We're going back to our original plan, cheesecake only." My fiancé backed me up. "We've already compromised once. The cheesecakes are what we want. They'll be beautiful and delicious." My mother didn't speak to me for 3 days after that conversation. We canceled the cake order entirely and went back to our original plan, a beautiful tiered cheesecake for us to cut, with mini cheesecakes for the guests. The bakery assured us they could make a stunning display that would look gorgeous in photos. Problem solved, or so we thought. For 6 fucking months, my mother brought up the cake situation at every opportunity. Family dinners. Phone calls. Even a random text on a Tuesday afternoon. "Just saw the most beautiful wedding cake at the Jones wedding. Sending you pictures now." I'd respond with variations of "looks nice, but we're sticking with cheesecake" before changing the subject. My sister noticed the tension and pulled me aside at a family barbecue. "What's up with Mom and this cake thing? She won't stop talking about it." I explained the situation, and my sister rolled her eyes. Classic Mom. Remember my graduation party when she insisted on getting that huge sheet cake even though I wanted to do an ice cream sundae bar? She always needs things to be her way. That conversation was actually reassuring, at least I wasn't the only one who dealt with this behavior. But it also made me realize this wasn't going to blow over. My mother was fixated on this cake issue, and she wasn't letting go. When the wedding was 4 months away, we had a meeting with our venue coordinator to finalize details. I specifically mentioned our cheesecake plan, and the coordinator made notes about table placement and display needs. My mother had asked to come along to this meeting, and I noticed her face tighten when the coordinator enthusiastically approved of our cheesecake idea. On the drive home, my mother was unusually quiet. I thought maybe she had finally accepted our decision. I was wrong. When the cake argument clearly wasn't working, she switched tactics. "What about a groom's cake?" she suggested casually during Sunday brunch 3 months before the wedding. It's tradition in many families. For those who don't know, A groom's cake is a smaller cake alongside the wedding cake, usually reflecting the groom's interests or tastes. Sometimes they're shaped like footballs or fishing equipment or whatever the groom is into. It's an old tradition that's made a comeback in recent years. I glanced at my fiancé, who immediately shook his head. He doesn't want one, I told her firmly. Her response? It's really only a groom's cake in name. It's not actually about what he wants. I stared at her for a full 10 seconds before responding. No. Absolutely not. We're having cheesecake. That's final. My fiancé reached under the table and squeezed my hand, silently thanking me for standing firm. My father, who had mostly stayed out of these discussions, finally spoke up. Let it go, he said to my mother. They've made their decision. She sulked through the rest of brunch, but I thought my father's intervention might have finally settled the matter. Wrong again. This conversation repeated itself at least 5 more times over the following weeks. At one point, my fiancé suggested we just elope and be done with it, but we'd already put down non-refundable deposits for most of our wedding vendors. 2 months before the wedding, my mother tried a different approach. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us. The first half hour was pleasant. She asked about work, my fiancé, our honeymoon plans. Then she pulled out her phone. I found a bakery that does the most gorgeous groom's cakes, she said, sliding her phone across the table to show me a gallery of elaborate cakes. And they could match any design element from your dress or invitations for a traditional cake too. We could do a tasting next week. I pushed the phone back toward her without looking at the images. Mom, stop. We've been over this. No traditional cake. No groom's cake. We're having cheesecake. But. No. This isn't up for discussion anymore. I'm getting really frustrated that you keep pushing this when we've been clear about what we want. She looked genuinely shocked that I was standing my ground. I'm just trying to help make your day special, she said. If you want to help make my day special, you can respect our decisions, I replied, keeping my voice level. She didn't bring up the cake again during that lunch, but the atmosphere was tense. When we parted, her hug was stiff and formal. I drove home feeling like the worst daughter in the world, even though logically I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. The weeks leading up to the wedding were busy with finalizing details. 3 weeks before the big day, I had a final meeting with the bakery to confirm our cheesecake order. Everything was set, a beautiful 3-tiered cheesecake for us to cut, decorated with fresh berries and edible flowers, plus 150 mini cheesecakes in various flavors for the guests. The owner assured me it would be stunning and delicious. Yesterday, exactly 2 weeks and 3 days before our wedding, I received a text from my mother, at Downtown Bakery finalizing details. So excited. Something about this message set off alarm bells. I hadn't included her in any bakery communications. Our final meeting had already happened. Why would she be finalizing details about anything? I called my fiancé right away. I think my mom is up to something with the bakery, I told him. Call them, he suggested. Better to know now than be surprised later. This morning, I called the bakery directly and spoke with an employee who sounded increasingly uncomfortable as our conversation progressed. After some hesitation, she confirmed my suspicion. My mother had shown up claiming to be helping with wedding details and had added a massive multi-tiered groom's cake to our order. As the employee described it, my stomach dropped. This wasn't a small addition. It wasn't a cute cake shaped like my fiancé's favorite sports team or hobby. It was a full-blown wedding cake with different fillings for each tier disguised as a groom's cake. We have it scheduled for delivery to your venue at 2 p.m. on your wedding day, the employee explained. The cheesecake will be delivered at the same time. Your mother specifically requested they be displayed side by side on the dessert table. The employee apologized profusely, admitting they should have confirmed with me first, but my mother had been so convincing about being authorized to make changes. She even had copies of our previous email communications with the bakery. How she got those, I have no idea, but it creeps me out to think she might have accessed my email somehow. Now I'm sitting here with my original cheesecake order plus a giant traditional wedding cake I specifically said multiple times I didn't want. The wedding is in less than 3 weeks, and I'm torn between confronting her now or waiting until the day of and acting shocked. My fiancé says to call her out immediately, but part of me wonders if I'm overreacting. It's just a cake, right? But it's not really about the cake anymore. It's about her completely disregarding our wishes for our wedding, going behind my back, and thinking she could manipulate the situation so I'd have no choice but to accept it. My best friend suggested canceling the cake and telling my mother afterwards, but I'm worried about the awkwardness that would create, especially since we'd still need to see her at pre-wedding events and, at the actual wedding. Am I being a bridezilla for wanting to put my foot down about this cake situation? Should I just let her have this one thing to keep the peace? It's not like having both desserts will ruin the wedding. But allowing this feels like I'm setting a precedent that she can ignore my boundaries and everything will be fine. Update. First of all, thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. I was overwhelmed by the responses and appreciate all the advice and support. The wedding happened back in October, and my husband and I just got back from our honeymoon yesterday, which was thankfully family drama free. By the time I posted, we were too close to the wedding day to cancel without losing thousands in deposits and breaking contracts with vendors, so we went ahead with the planned ceremony and reception despite the cake drama and other issues with my mother. To address a common question from the comments, yes, my parents contributed financially to the wedding. They covered about 60% of the total cost, with my husband and I paying for the rest. We had repeatedly told them we didn't expect them to pay for everything and were prepared to cover costs ourselves, but they insisted. My parents are comfortably well off and have always been generous with financial support. What made the situation more frustrating was that my parents had repeatedly told us, "This is your day, do what you want." My mother specifically said early in the planning process, "I had my wedding, this one is yours." The cake apparently didn't fall under that generous offer of autonomy. After reading the comments on my original post, I considered several options for handling the situation. 1. Call the bakery and change the cake design to something my mom would hate. Suggestions included zombie themes, inappropriate shapes, or ridiculously bright colors too. Cancel the cake entirely and forfeit her deposit. 3. Pretend I didn't know and act shocked/upset at the wedding. 4. Confront her directly before the wedding. 5. Accept the cake but have it served at the rehearsal dinner instead. 6. Have the cake delivered but placed in a less prominent position, like near the exit or in another room entirely. Many of you suggested option 1, and I won't lie, the thought of her face seeing a zombie apocalypse cake instead of her elegant traditional design was tempting. One commenter suggested having it redesigned to look like a giant cheesecake, which made me laugh out loud. But after taking a few days to think about it, I realized that matching her petty behavior with my own would only create more problems and tension heading into our wedding day. I wanted to be able to look back on our wedding without regrets about how I handled things, even if my mother's behavior was completely out of line. I chose option 4, which many of you predicted wouldn't go well. You were absolutely right. I invited my parents over for dinner the weekend after discovering the cake situation. After a tense meal where my mother kept trying to discuss wedding details as if nothing was wrong, I finally brought up the issue. Now this is kinda what I remember, but it's not the exact words I or they said. So take it with a grain of salt. Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you about something serious. I called the bakery this week and found out that Mom ordered a traditional wedding cake behind my back after I repeatedly said we didn't want one. My mother immediately became defensive. I wanted to surprise you. It's going to be beautiful, and you'll thank me later when you see the pictures. That's not the point, I said. The point is that you went behind my back to do something I specifically said I didn't want. Multiple times. You're overreacting, she replied. It's just a cake. I don't understand why you're so upset about something so small. My father, looking uncomfortable, tried to mediate. Your mother meant well. She just wants your day to be perfect. Perfect for who? I asked. Because a perfect day for me and fiancé includes respecting our choices. This isn't the first time during wedding planning that Mom has pushed boundaries, but it's definitely the most blatant example. I went on to explain calmly why her actions had hurt me. I pointed out that this wasn't the first boundary she'd crossed during wedding planning, and that going behind my back was disrespectful not just to me but to my soon-to-be husband. The conversation quickly deteriorated from there. My mother actually started crying, claiming I was accusing her of trying to ruin my wedding when all she wanted was to help. My father kept trying to smooth things over without actually addressing the problem. I ended the evening by saying, I love you both, but this behavior isn't okay. I need you to understand that. The next day, my mother sent multiple paragraph-long texts completely missing the point. She kept apologizing for ruining the wedding with a cake while refusing to acknowledge the actual issue, that she deliberately went behind my back to impose her vision on our day, knowing it would upset me. No matter how many times I tried to redirect the conversation to the real problem, her boundary stomping, she couldn't or wouldn't understand. I tried explaining it different ways. It's not about the cake itself, it's about you making decisions for our wedding after we explicitly said no. How would you feel if I went behind your back to change something important to you, after you'd clearly stated your preference? This is about respect. When someone says no, that should be the end of the discussion. None of it got through. Her final compromise was to move the groom's cake to the rehearsal dinner instead of having it at the reception. I agreed just to end the conversation, though part of me wanted to stand firm on principle. At that point, we were 1 week from the wedding. The stress of continuing to fight about this while handling last-minute details wasn't worth it. I dropped the issue and focused on the wedding itself. My fiancé was supportive throughout, though I could tell he was as frustrated as I was. "Whatever you decide, I'm behind you," he said. "But for what it's worth, I think you've been more than patient with her." On the actual day, I interacted with my mother as little as possible. Our wedding party and coordinator ran interference when needed, keeping her busy with small tasks away from me. My maid of honor, aware of the situation, was particularly helpful at redirecting my mother whenever she tried to pull me aside for something unnecessary. The ceremony went perfectly. We wrote our own vows, which made many guests tear up, including my father, surprisingly. The reception was lively and fun, and most importantly, drama-free. The original cheesecakes were served at the reception and were a massive hit with guests. Many people commented on how refreshing it was to have something different from the usual wedding cake. The groom's cake appeared at the rehearsal dinner, where it received polite attention but was largely forgotten in the excitement of the upcoming wedding. My mother made a point of taking lots of pictures of us next to it, which I allowed to keep the peace. Our honeymoon was 2 wonderful weeks in New Zealand, completely unplugged from family drama. It was exactly what we needed after the stress of wedding planning. Since returning home, I've maintained minimal contact with my mother. We talk on the phone maybe once a week instead of our previous almost daily calls. I don't share many details about our newlywed life, keeping conversations surface level. She's noticed the change but hasn't directly addressed it. My father called once to ask if everything was okay between my mother and me, and I told him honestly that I needed some space after the wedding stress. We'll need to have more serious conversations eventually, but right now I'm focusing on enjoying married life and getting back into therapy to deal with all this bullshit. My previous therapist helped me work through family dynamics years ago, and I think it's time for a refresher course. The irony in all of this is that if my mother had simply respected our wishes from the beginning, our relationship would be in a much better place now. Her insistence on having things her way has resulted in exactly what she probably feared, me pulling away. Weddings really do bring out people's true colors. I never realized how controlling my mother could be until I got engaged. If I could do it all over again, I'd elope in a heartbeat. Update. It's been exactly 1 year since our wedding, and several people have messaged asking for an update. The timing is perfect because I've been reflecting on everything while helping some newly engaged friends navigate their own family drama. I'll cut straight to it. Having a traditional wedding with my family dynamics was a colossal mistake. When I look back at what should have been one of the happiest days of my life, I don't primarily remember exchanging vows with my husband or dancing at our reception. Instead, I remember the constant anxiety of wondering when my mother would cause the next scene. The cake incident was just the final straw in a pattern that began the moment we got engaged. Here's what I didn't share in my original post. Within 10 minutes of my husband telling my parents he planned to propose, my mother had texted, called, or emailed literally everyone in her contact list with the news, before he even had a chance to ask me. Several relatives congratulated me before the actual proposal happened. When I confronted her about stealing our moment, she said, "I was just so excited I couldn't help myself." The day after we got engaged, she showed up at our apartment unannounced with 3 binders full of wedding ideas she'd apparently been collecting for years. Each contained hundreds of magazine clippings, Pinterest printouts, and handwritten notes about venues, dresses, and color schemes. When I told her we needed time to discuss what kind of wedding we wanted, she looked genuinely confused. "But I've already done all the research," she said, as if that settled everything. When I shared our engagement photos, her first comment wasn't "Congratulations, but you look really big in these pictures." Those photos, which should be treasured memories, now make me wince whenever I see them in our album. My husband insists I look beautiful in them, but my mother's comment echoes in my head every time. During dress shopping, she vetoed every dress I liked as too simple or not bridal enough. I ended up choosing one when she was in the bathroom just so I could have something I actually wanted. When I showed her later, she spent 20 minutes pointing out how it could be improved with more beading, a longer train, or a different neckline. At my bridal shower, a family friend commented on how beautiful I looked. My mother responded within earshot of half the guests, "Yeah, well, she's gained a lot of weight recently." The room went silent, and I had to retreat to the bathroom to pull myself together. My sister followed me and found me hyperventilating. "She's just nervous about the wedding," my sister said, trying to make excuses. "You know how she gets." But I didn't know. Not really. Not until planning this wedding. For every decision, flowers, music, invitations, seating, my mother had an opinion that she presented as fact. If we chose something she didn't like, she'd bring it up repeatedly until we either changed our minds from exhaustion or stood our ground and dealt with her sulking. On our wedding day, she attempted to crash our private first look photos despite knowing it was meant to be a moment just for my husband and me. Our photographer had chosen a beautiful garden spot, and we were in the middle of an emotional moment when my mother appeared, camera in hand. When our wedding coordinator politely blocked her, explaining this was a private moment as discussed in our timeline meeting, she burst into tears and complained to anyone who would listen that I was keeping her out of important moments. During the reception, my new mother-in-law overheard my mother telling one of her friends that I had always been difficult and refused to take any advice during planning. This, while eating cake she had ordered behind my back, sitting at tables she had selected, surrounded by flowers she had insisted on. Throughout the reception, she told multiple guests how controlling I had been during planning and how she wasn't allowed to have any input. She even pulled my husband aside during our first dance to tell him, good luck dealing with her stubborn streak. He was so shocked he nearly missed a step. 1 year later, our relationship remained strained. We speak occasionally, usually when my father is also on the call. Family gatherings are polite but tense. I'm extremely careful about what information I share with her. The first few months after the wedding, she acted as if nothing had happened. When I maintained my distance, she began asking other family members why I was still upset about that cake thing. As if the cake was the only issue, and not the culmination of months of boundary crossing. There has never been a genuine apology or acknowledgement of how her behavior impacted what should have been a joyful time. The closest she came was saying, "I'm sorry you felt that way about the wedding," which is not an apology at all. My father, who I always saw as the more reasonable parent, has been a disappointment in the situation. He continues to make excuses for her behavior. That's just how your mother is, or she meant well, or she's from a generation that does things differently. As if that justifies the manipulation and disrespect. My husband has been my rock through all of this. He never pushes me to reconcile for the sake of family harmony, and he supports whatever level of contact I feel comfortable with. But I deeply regret not standing firm on my initial desire to elope to a remote location with just the two of us. We could have had a small celebration with friends later, on our own terms. Instead, we spent thousands of dollars on an event that now brings mixed emotions at best. For anyone reading this who's newly engaged, pay attention to those early warning signs. If family members start overstepping boundaries during initial planning, it will only escalate. Set firm boundaries immediately or seriously consider alternatives to traditional weddings. If you notice your mom, dad, in-laws, or anyone else making your engagement about them instead of celebrating your relationship, run, don't walk, to the courthouse or your nearest travel agency. Book that elopement package. Skip the family drama. Your wedding should reflect you and your partner, not serve as a stage for family members to perform their own dramas. I wish I'd realized that sooner. The one bright spot? Those cheesecakes really were fucking delicious. We ordered one again, and it was the perfect way to reclaim at least one good memory from that day.